Cool.
Okay. So, Kimberly, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our viewers. We will be talking today about children and the effect of the quarantine or lockdown on their mental health, as well as some teenage and child mental health issues in general. Kimberly Jones is joining me today. She is a licensed clinical social worker, I believe is the right term. And I'm going to let her introduce herself now. She'll talk to us in a minute about these issues.
Okay. So as was already mentioned, I am a licensed clinical social worker. I got my master's degree from UCLA. And before coming out, I'm actually originally from Massachusetts. Got my bachelor's in psychology and education. My first real kind of world in psychology out of undergrad was I worked on an adolescent dialectical behavioral therapy unit for a couple of years. And I did that until I moved out here for grad school and have been working with families, adolescents, individuals, doing mindfulness-based work, DBT-based work for a while now. It's crazy how fast time goes by, but that's, I guess, just a little bit about me and my background.
Thanks.
So thanks for having me.
When Kimberly says here, she means Los Angeles, which is
Yes,
also
Los
where I
Angeles.
am. Many of our viewers will be in New York and in other places around the US and the world. So thanks to everybody for joining us. I want to get back to DBT in a moment, but I was hoping we could start with an issue that many of our members have asked for advice on, both before the pandemic hit and more particularly during this latest 6 or 7 weeks when we've all been more isolated and less able to go about our normal lives. And that is the issue of anxiety. We all know anxiety. We've all experienced it at one level or another. I might have had a little before we started taping here today, or before my driving test, or if I'm going to get on an airplane and go to somewhere I've never been, I might have a little anxiety. But when does anxiety flip from that sort of normal, little nervy kind of feeling that we all push through into being something that's more pathological, more worrisome, actually affects a kid's life? When does that happen? How does that happen? What should parents look for? Could you address that a little bit?
Sure. So, I think you touched upon something really important, which is so many people struggle with anxiety at different points in life, right? And it's an emotion that we're not going to get rid of. Like, we're all going to have it. We're all going to feel it, right? And it's an emotion that serves a function. It's important that it's there. With that being said, I think you also touched upon the fact that there is a point where anxiety can actually become beyond the anxiety that everybody experiences, and it becomes something more problematic. And it's hard, I think, especially as parents, to know when that line is of when it's something to really be more concerned about. What I actually always say to anybody that I work with in terms of individual work or even parents is I think about things often in terms of duration, frequency, and intensity. So, if you're noticing that, for example, like one of the things that we know that's really common for people who struggle with anxiety is a lot of those excessive worry thoughts, right? Like kind of that snowball effect of like, oh my gosh, like I didn't put enough time aside to study for my paper. And then, that turns into, well, if I fail this paper, I'm going to fail this test. And I fail this test, I'm going to fail out of high school, right? So we all can have those snowball thoughts, but is it coming up every single day? How many hours out of the day are you noticing that your child is talking about these things that make them anxious? Are they having a lot of kind of psychomotor agitation? So are you noticing that they're really keyed up? Are they having difficulty sleeping? Are they not eating? So these are some of the things, if you notice it's happening, okay, more than like, it's coming up on a pretty regular basis, and it seems like it's actually consuming most of their time and energy, that would be a time that I would really say it might be good to just, at the very least, what I always say to parents is like, hey, if you come in and I meet with your kid a couple of times and it turns out they're actually like experiencing normal anxiety, that's great. But if you're concerned, if you notice disrupting activities of daily living, if they can't concentrate, if they can't sleep, like those types of things, that's when I would say, okay, you might want to actually sit down and have a conversation with your child and say like, hey, these are some of the things that I'm noticing. can we talk a little bit more about what's going on? And I think the other thing too is, kids know themselves pretty well, right? Like teenagers especially. And so I think opening up that dialogue and asking them what they think too, like that can be a really useful place to start.
Okay, so a lot of food for thought in there. One thing that struck me is you're advising that we sit down with a kid and say, I'm noticing these behaviors. What do you say next? Like, I know kids can be very touchy.
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to say to my son, hey, I noticed that you've been really, tapping your foot all the time and you don't seem like you're able to get your homework done, he's probably going to say, Mom, I'm fine, leave me alone.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you move beyond that into some sort of a dialogue?
Yeah. I mean, I think, the other thing I would say too, in terms of opening up any of these conversations, is timing can be, we always talk about, in general with interpersonal effectiveness, like thinking about the timing of when you're bringing it up, right? So if your kid is already in the midst of having an anxiety attack or having a panic attack, or they're stressing about that thing, that might not be the time that you want to necessarily go in there and have that conversation. With that being said, I think that coming at it from a place of curiosity and coming at it from a place of not drawing any conclusions or not telling them how they're feeling or what's going on, like that can, I think for anybody beyond just adolescents, right? Like that actually opens up more comfort in having the conversation. I think the other thing too is that, especially with kids, like they may have a reaction, right? Like they may have that like storm out, like, I don't want to talk about this right now, and I think it's okay. Like, something I'll touch upon a little bit more, but if you notice that the intensity of their emotion at a 1 out of 10 seems to go up to a 7, like them actually taking some space and calming down and regulating is actually like more effective. Like let them have that space and time, and then trying to reapproach the conversation when maybe their emotion intensity is a little lower. I think that's
so even if they say, I'm fine, leave me alone, and they run into their room and slam the door, you're saying don't confront them on their anger, don't chase them, but maybe bring it up later.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously, like, you think about the circumstances, if safety is a concern or anything of that nature, obviously. But, one of the things I was going to touch upon this, one of the things that we do in different modalities of therapy, we talk about something called the SUD scale, or subjective units of distress. And so we talk about how, when you're thinking about an emotion, you want to think about, okay, if it seems like your kid is angry, right? On a scale of 1 to 10, if their anger seems like it's at like a 9 or a 10, they're so flooded, and you're probably starting to get flooded with your own anxiety and your own anger, that like you're not going to have an effective conversation anyway, right? Mm-hmm. And so really, like, you can try to go in, you can try to have that conversation, but I think that escalation point that everybody's trying to avoid, it's probably not going to happen in that moment. And yet, if you both can take your own space and time to get regulated, to sort of get things where your SUDs are lower, right? Maybe you're at like a 2, 3, then it does, usually make it a little easier to have that conversation.
Is it reasonable or effective, which are two different things, right? To say to a kid, okay, I can see that you're really upset and angry right now, so I'm going to back off, but we really do need to have this conversation, so I'm going to probably bring it up again tomorrow, or something like that. Is that useful, or is that just sort of adding more fuel to the fire?
I mean, it's tough. Like, I wish I could kind of give you like a unilateral like answer, because it also, I think, depends on the kid, right? Like some kids, I feel like that kind of like straightforward sort of like, this is what's going to happen, maybe that's containing and comforting for them. But, I think for other kids, it's more sensitive. They might find that like to be threatening. I think in an instance like that, maybe what I would recommend more of is like, rather than saying like, I can see that you are upset, is you could say something like, I'm noticing that it seems like your breathing's really heavy, and it seems like you're really tense, right? And like the way you're holding your body is like you're really tense right now. I'm wondering if you're angry. It seems like maybe this isn't the best time to have this conversation. I'm going to give you some space, come back and try to talk to you about this maybe later. And
so you can see, I can't even talk to you right about it. I don't know if I have a chance with a kid.
Well, this is the thing, is like, I think that's something I want to be really clear about, is like, like one of the things we talk about a lot in, my strongest area of orientation, I already mentioned, is dialectical behavioral therapy and mindfulness, is really letting go of this idea of right and wrong, and more so like just trying to think about things in terms of like what's actually effective, right? And so at the end of the day, like we're all doing the best we can. That's like one of the kind of the things we put out there a lot. And I think that I just kind of bring it back to, if we can be non-judgmental in our approach, right? Or we can be aware of what judgments are coming up, it tends to help neutralize reactivity from both sides if people are coming at it from more of like a fact-based perspective. So rather than putting the assumption like you are feeling this, just kind of sharing what you're observing, and that might just keep the other person a little bit more open.
That's really good advice. So take your own judgment out of it. Even if you don't think you're being judgy, you're still defining somebody else's feelings, which isn't respectful, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think if we all took a moment to just reflect on our own experience, like I think most of us at some point have had somebody else tell us like, oh, you're really upset. Oh, you seem like you're like feeling this right now. And it just kind of creates that sort of secondary response of like, well, you don't know what I'm feeling, right? And so then kind of that defensiveness. So, I think kind of just mentalizing or holding that position of like, oh, when that's happened to me, I tend to shut down. So it's probably not going to work with the other person.
What about other symptoms besides anger and defiance? What about kids who cry or kids who withdraw? What might that indicate, and how should parents deal with that?
Well, it's tough. I mean, I think that, if you're noticing a lot of excessive crying, like it's happening, most days of the week, or it's happening a lot throughout the day, you're noticing a lot of isolation, withdrawal from social activities, expressions of like any intent or wanting to hurt oneself, like, and some overlapping in terms of symptoms like not eating, not sleeping. I think these are areas where we start to get concerned, like, okay, maybe this person is struggling with depression, right? And at the same time, like, we want to be careful not to pathologize healthy and normal expression of emotion either. So, I think if your kid, especially if you've noticed like lately, like if you notice they are more tearful or they're struggling, like that might just be some appropriate sadness based off of the circumstances. But, if you're noticing it is happening a lot, if it seems like there's shifts in their personality or shifts in, lack of engagement with friends or things that they used to enjoy doing, that might be a time where you'd want to, either see if you can approach having a conversation with them, or, maybe getting yourself some support and some parent coaching or some therapy, and kind of saying like, hey, this is what I'm struggling with and noticing. And, I think if something is kind of telling you like something seems like off or wrong or different, like I think, that's important to pay attention to.
So much like there's a sort of a normal or healthy level of anxiety that everybody has, it's a fact of nature. Sadness is also a normal emotion and can be a very healthy response to loss or grief. We're all experiencing loss right now, and some kids are experiencing a lot of loss of expectations, of friendships, of social opportunities. What are some healthy ways to deal with that sort of loss? Both, from a parent trying to help a kid, and also just for us. We're all in similar boats, right? Or at least on the same sea.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, something that I think can be really challenging when it comes to an emotion like sadness or an emotion like grief is that I think when we see somebody else struggling with it, there can be this tendency of, we start to get anxious or worrying about needing to fix it, right? And then that, I think, can be invalidating for the other person and their experience, and also kind of creates like a further sense of isolation, or like, what's wrong with me that I'm experiencing this emotion or I'm feeling this way, right? So, I think there is a really great article. It was by UC Berkeley, and they were just talking a lot about, right now how kids, especially adolescents, like all these things that are sort of like a rite of passage, like prom, graduation, just senior class trips, like all these things, when we're kind of a society that has so we don't have that many acknowledgments of sort of that transition from adolescence into adulthood, right? And so these things are significant to them. And I think the other thing is that's important to keep in mind is like sometimes we as adults have a hard time kind of recognizing like, oh, they don't have the life experience to put this loss into perspective, right? So for them, it is actually a really big deal. And I think one of the first places you can start is, you know, acknowledging their loss, right? And acknowledging that it is a loss for them, because then, you know, I think it also helps them not to invalidate or discredit their own emotion. So starting off with that acknowledgement, right? Then the other thing that you can do is you can actually help them like try to name their feeling, right? Like try to help them actually like explore that and what's coming up in relationship to that, right? So it's like, you know, for some kids, like they may be struggling with the sadness around losing graduation, but what the emotion we're seeing is anger, right? So we might be seeing anxiety, right? But underneath that, there's something else that's sort of driving the emotion that they're expressing outwardly. So actually helping them try to put words to it, right? And try to actually like label it, that can be really, really helpful.
So what kinds of
and then
questions could you ask to do that wouldn't make the kid feel like they're getting drilled or the third degree?
Mm-hmm,
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really just coming back to that place of curiosity, like, you know, starting off with like acknowledging what the loss is, right? So it's like, hey, you know, I know your graduation's been canceled. You know, and I think what actually can be really helpful is saying something like, you know, I imagine if my graduation was canceled, I might be feeling sad. I imagine if I hadn't got to go to my prom, I would be feeling like, you know, this is really unfair, right? And so sometimes actually being able to show and mirror that empathy of understanding, right? So that can be one way. You know, another thing we talk about with this concept of validation, which just basically means acknowledging the other person's emotion or experience, is really coming at it with that sort of like, did I get that right? Does this seem accurate to you, right? Like trying to take that non-assuming place so you can reflect like, hey, it seems like you might be feeling this right now, or I imagine I might be feeling this. Is that accurate, right? Like really come at it with that sense of kind of curiosity. And if they say, no, that's not it, or, you know, just like, you don't have to push that, right? Like maybe they're not ready to go there or have that conversation, but like starting with that place of, hey, this is what I'm noticing, this is what I'm seeing, I would imagine I would feel this, like that kind of thing can help.
And if a parent decides that they think they need some professional help during this, particularly now when we can't go see a doctor in person probably, are there resources that you would recommend for parents that we can post them on comments to this video link later, but are there online resources that people can go to?
Yeah, there's actually, I can send you a couple of things too to be able to post afterwards, but there's actually this really great resource from Johns Hopkins. It's kind of this big PDF that they offer for free. And what's actually really great about it is they kind of go through and they outline adolescence, right? Like what's kind of normal adolescent development, and then like what are maybe some things when, you know, you kind of start to notice shifts or things to be concerned about, right? So there's a lot of great material in that. There's this book I know at the clinic that I work at, Westside DBT, that we tell a lot of parents to read, called Get Out of My Life, but First Can You Take Cheryl and Me to the Mall?
I've heard of that book.
Yeah, and I think that one's really good because it helps you sort of understand like how normative it is and how developmentally appropriate some of this kind of egocentric view of the world and inability to validate back is. Because I think sometimes, as you know, I will say, even as a practitioner, sometimes working with a kid when they're kind of coming at you with anger, right? Like it's hard not to feel like it's personal. And then I think as parents, it's even like tenfold. And then when you're trying to validate and you're not receiving that back, it can be so frustrating. So that's a really great book because I think it kind of it outlines that. And then so I went off on one of my classic tangents. There's so much material I could put out there. But the other thing I was just going to say is a lot of books on the basics of mindfulness and just kind of learning to be present and slow down. Like, I think that's such a useful thing for parents to know more about and read about, because I think one of the biggest things I can say in terms of like being a parent and helping your kid is making sure you're resourced as well in yourself, and you have your own support and your own relaxation tools, and your own understanding of your emotions and how they cause you to react. And I think, again, I could give you some books to check out in that realm as well. But
so when I hear mindfulness, I think meditation. Are you talking about incorporating a mindfulness practice into your own life or your family life? Or is there a way of bringing mindfulness into non-meditative moments in life?
Yeah, so I think you touched upon something really important, which is, I think when most people hear mindfulness, they think sit meditation where you're breathing, and there's actually meditation is a form of mindfulness, but not all mindfulness is meditation, right? And so mindfulness is this concept of being aware in the present moment, increasing your awareness of what's happening, but also increasing our ability to focus in and pay attention. So it's really this idea of paying attention on purpose. And the reason why it's useful for parents, for adolescents, for anybody, is that it starts to help us be able to become more aware of what we're feeling as we're feeling it, what we're thinking as we're thinking it, and also becoming aware of our behaviors and how we respond. And in that space of awareness, we start to create the ability to intervene and to do things differently. So that's mindfulness in a nutshell.
That makes sense. I know for me, in dealing with a kid with anxiety, I had to get over my own guilt. I felt like if I was a better mom, or if I had done this or that right or better, then he would not have the struggles he was having. And when I was locked into that mindset, the only thing I could offer him were my suggestions for how to fix it, which of course 100% backfired, as I think a lot of parents have experienced. So I like what you're talking about, being resourced oneself as a parent, having support system that isn't the kid, not needing the kid to validate your feelings, but rather having your own set of validation so that you can bring sort of a strong, peaceful, kind, and calm front into this situation. And then being aware that what you are feeling could lead you to have reactions that are not helpful to the kid, essentially.
Yeah, and actually I thought about what you're describing right now, this experience of like kind of the sense of the parent of what's wrong with me, that like my kid is sort of reacting this way, or this emotion is coming up for them. And there was this really interesting quote I actually came across yesterday, and kind of thinking about that concept, where it talks about how Windicott, a psychiatrist, talks about how, being the perfect mother or the perfect parent is actually not going to be useful to your kid, because it's going to create this sense that things have to be perfect, right? But what's actually going to be more useful to them is a mother or a parent who recognizes, oh, wow, I just got really angry, or I just had that kind of response, and is able to actually, apologize for it, or kind of engage in that sort of corrective response, because then it teaches like, oh, I can have reactions, I can do things imperfectly, and then I can use that information to sort of do things differently going forward. And that's actually more useful for adolescents especially.
Yeah, one of my favorite sayings, I'm not sure where I read it, is I dole out a lot of forgiveness because I need even more. And I think it's good to kind of keep that in mind if we approach it as I can apologize and be forgiven, and I can also offer that to other people.
Yeah,
To me,
exactly.
that seems like a good thing to teach our kids. I want to just dive into professional help just for a moment here. So you mentioned DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. I know that's one modality. Could you tell me what that means in a nutshell, and what a couple of other sort of common modalities might be?
Yeah, so dialectical behavioral therapy, It's a type of behavioral therapy. It was actually developed by a woman named Marsha Linehan. And what's really great about DBT is that it offers skills, it offers tools to individuals. There's a whole skills group component to it where they learn different in different modules, different things that they can do to regulate their emotions, to tolerate their distress, to increase mindfulness, and to have better interpersonal relationships, right? So it offers all these skills and all these tools to individuals who participate in individual therapy and in group to learn how to regulate themselves, identify their emotions. DBT is one modality of therapy. There's a lot of other there's traditional talk psychotherapy, right, which can be really useful, just like having a space to a more kind of psychodynamic oriented space where you just kind of go in, you process, you talk about the feeling, and sometimes it's that space of being able to look at emotion and gain insight that can be really useful. There's cognitive behavioral therapy, which DBT was actually in many ways born from CBT and some other modalities of therapy, but cognitive behavioral therapy can be really good for anxiety. DBT is great for anxiety as well, but it kind of just depends on the flavor of what the person needs. But
so cognitive versus dialectical, is one more about thinking and one more about talking, or what differentiates them?
I think that just kind of to give you the briefest answer to that I can would be CBT is a little bit more change focused, a little bit more about you're trying to work on identifying the thought, changing the thought, right? There's a lot of tools around change, and DBT offers this sort of acceptance validation component, and it's a little bit more about kind of trying to strike the balance between the two. And that doesn't mean that one is actually better than the other. They just offer different things. Like, for example, with depending on the type of anxiety a person has, if they have more kind of compulsive type of anxiety or OCD, something like traditional cognitive behavioral therapy might be more helpful for that. But it depends on the person and the individual as well, because if they have other stuff in conjunction with that too, DBT might be more helpful. So it sort of depends.
Okay. I noticed that you had a Psychology Today number, I guess. Mm-hmm. Is Psychology Today a good resource people can use to find a local therapist?
Yeah, Psychology Today is great if you put in your address and your location. Different therapists will pop up, and then what's nice is they'll kind of name their areas of specialty, right? So if you're looking for a family therapist, you can kind of look to see on there good people who kind of specialize in that particular area, or if you're looking for somebody who's focused more on self-esteem, right? Like so there's just you'll kind of get a sense from people's profiles and different things that they've checked off. So Psychology Today can be great. One thing I will say that I know is a struggle for a lot of people is you can always go to your insurance and ask for a list of providers, because there can be some difficulty around finding providers who are covered by insurance. My only recommendation would be, if you get a list from your insurance company, just make sure you're doing your research and you're kind of maybe looking at that person and just kind of what their area of specialty is. And but you can always ask your insurance for a list if you're looking to go through your insurance and kind of do some research that way.
And what about using? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
What about using telemedicine type of tools? Is that, I've heard radio ads for therapists that you can find on the internet. Do you think those are reputable services? And if so, might we be able to recommend one or two to our listeners?
Yeah, I am not extraordinarily familiar with, I know there's services like Talkspace or BetterHelp. I'm not extremely familiar with what it is that they provide and how useful that is. But what I will say is I think telemedicine it's a great resource that we have now, especially given everything that's been going on, to be able to offer these individual therapy services or psychiatry appointments or different things like through Zoom or through other telehealth resources. I think, again, I would just say like it's definitely worth exploring. And I think it's about figuring out what's right for you. Because if some people can't, I know especially with kids, like they're so busy and they've got so much going on. And depending on the level of severity or what's coming up for them, it's maybe just exploring if seeing somebody through Zoom or telehealth, maybe that's a better option for them. But I think it's definitely worth exploring. And I think those resources have opened up to people getting a lot more help that they couldn't necessarily get before.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. And I guess last question here, to try to end on a positive note, if we can. Okay. What do you think some of the benefits are of this sort of what I've been calling the enforced togetherness that we've been experiencing as families in the last several weeks? What are the sort of short-term, long-term benefits here? For me, honestly, it's been amazing to have so much time with my son. Normally, I wouldn't have this much time with him.
Right.
To me, I feel like we're making great memories. Do you think there are long-term benefits of this kind of closeness?
I can't necessarily say what the long-term benefits are going to be. What I will say is this: this clinician that I work with, his name is Chris. He said it, and I thought it was just so spot on. He said something like, "Kids aren't going to remember all the details of what happened during this time, but they're going to remember." Not putting it as great as he did, but basically they're going to remember the experience of how their parents and how their families kind of responded to what's happening and the emotions that came up around it, right? Because so much for us in terms of memory, emotion and memory are so tied and so closely linked together. And I think what I know I'm hearing a lot from different people and I think just from different adolescents is, spending more time like with their siblings and developing better relationships with their siblings. I think just some of the things that we never thought we were going to have to experience, and then just watching everybody try to learn and grow together, just creates like some laughs and some unique interactions that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten to have. And I think also just making time, I think for everybody, we can always put off like making that phone call or connecting with that friend. And I think we're actually sort of like forced more now to like recognize like, oh, this is a relationship I want to grow and develop. So I think that it's kind of been a gift in all this terribleness of time to actually prioritize family and relationships. So.
Yep. Well, there's a lot more we could talk about. I'd love to spend more time, but we're trying to keep this short and honor your time. Yes. I really want to appreciate your professional expertise here and all the advice you gave us. For people watching, we will post some links to sites where you can access some resources. And Kimberly Jones, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.